Hello, everyone. I hope you are all doing well and you're getting settled into the beginning of the course. If you're taking any one of my philosophy courses this summer, or if you're just watching this video on YouTube, hey, you don't have any homework, so that's okay. In this video, I'm going to go over some very basic concepts in logic. So I'm just titling this video, What is Logic? All right. Okay, now one thing you'll notice about philosophers and philosophy in general is that we are very particular and really obsessed, you could say, with the meaning of our words and actually using words and concepts consistently. And logic is a tool that we use to check for consistency. Logic in the history of the development of logic sort of arose out of a concern for being abundantly clear and concise with our language. And the reason why this is important is because a lot of times what we think are disputes about the facts, meaning what there is and what is real, what the facts are. A lot of times things that we think are disputes about what the facts actually are really just verbal disputes. So you and I may actually agree on what the facts are, and we may actually agree on what is true, but the way we're using language is not abundantly clear. So verbal disputes don't necessitate factual disputes. So a lot of times language can be ambiguous or vague, and in philosophy in particular, with emphasis on logic and critical thinking, this is one of the major reasons why philosophers are so concerned. We want to make sure that we eliminate any sort of ambiguous or vague language just so we can clearly communicate with each other. Okay, so here's an example. Logic, and logical and things like that gets used in non-technical kinds of ways. So, you might hear in common conversation things like, well, that's not a logical thing to believe, or she's a very logical kind of person, or my favorite one, anytime somebody says, well, you're not basing your view on any logic or facts. I care about logic and facts and you don't, and I base my belief on logic and facts. Haha. A lot of times when people speak this way, I don't really think they know what they're talking about. So, logic and facts are a lot of times are just placeholders for, I can't actually provide evidence or reasons for my belief, but I'm just gonna, be a champion of logic. So there's one pop intellectual who is a self-declared, champion of logic and speaker of truths. But then when you look at what this person is saying under a critical eye, there's not much there. It's a lot of fluff. So it's a really impressive vocabulary, but without much reasoning to back it up. Okay, now, so that's fine if you want to use the term that way, but at the end of the day, we philosophers aren't really all that concerned with the non-technical use of language. So the fact that certain words or phrases have an acceptable use in non-technical contexts, philosophers, I don't think we need to pay attention necessarily to those non-technical contexts. So you should never start a philosophical debate by reciting the dictionary. Why? Because philosophers don't write the dictionaries. And all dictionaries do is report what's known as the lexical meaning of words and phrases and communication. So whether or not something is lexical is just determined by whether it has a demonstrated history of a certain kind of usage. But obvious, and that's one of the reasons why new words get added to the dictionary every year, because when a word becomes acceptable to use, it depends upon the amount of time and the context in which it is used. So the fact that the dictionary says something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good definition of what it says. So if you approach a philosopher and say, well, I'm looking in Webster's dictionary right here and it defines this word this way, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how the philosopher or the scientist or anybody else in a technical discipline specific field with sort of maybe a more narrow range of the appropriate usage of words, that doesn't necessarily mean that is how the philosopher or the scientist or the doctor or anybody else is using that word. So yeah, we philosophers, we don't really care what the dictionary says at the end of the day. Okay, now, so in the technical sense, what do we mean when we say that something is logical? What we really mean in philosophy is this: logic is a concern for consistency. So logic involves the study of different kinds of arguments and ways of checking to see if the premises or the reasons given in favor of any conclusion of an argument actually support the conclusion. So if you were to take an Intro to Logic course or an Intro to Critical Thinking course, what you would be learning is not only different kinds of arguments and how they work, but you would be evaluating different kinds of methods and learning different kinds of methods to see if the arguments are any good. At the end of the day, whether or not your argument is any good is going to depend upon whether the premises that are stated actually do lend support for the conclusion. And in the next video, I'll be talking specifically about deductive arguments and inductive arguments, all right, which are the kinds of main kinds of arguments that we're going to be using in this class in particular. All right, now, and then logic gets more advanced. So if you're doing symbolic logic or mathematical logic, you're taking natural language arguments, English arguments, and translating them mathematically, and then, purely symbolically, and then you're using mathematical rules and things like that to see if the conclusion follows from the premises. More advanced forms of mathematical logic get into actually building logical systems from sets of axioms and sets of theorems. So I won't talk too much about this, but axioms in a logical system are basically primary truths of the system that you need in order for the system to work. So if something is a logical axiom of a logical system, you can't prove it that it's an axiom. You can't prove that it's an axiom without assuming that it's true. So the axioms work this way. So in order to have an axiom of a logical system, you can't have the system. Nothing is provable within the system without that axiom. So for example, in a lot of logical systems, the law of non-contradiction, the idea that for any statement, any proposition, it can't be the case that that proposition is both true and false. You can't use a logical system to prove that the law of non-contradiction is true. You have to assume that it's true, right? And then there are theorems. Theorems can be derived from axioms using the rules of the system, and so on and so on and so on. So that all gets rather technical, but it's worth mentioning here. Okay, now so here I'm only talking about logic and critical thinking and reasoning in terms of consistency here. So when we are talking about consistency, what are we talking about? All right, so a set of claims or statements is consistent if the set does not contain any contradictions. Okay, so what logic is a tool then that we use to test for consistency, as I mentioned before. Okay, so here's an example. So take these three claims. Claim 1. Our having free will is necessary for our being morally responsible for our actions. So our having free will is necessary for our being morally responsible for our actions. Claim 2, we do not have free will. And claim 3, we are morally responsible for our actions. All right, so let's go back again. So 1, our having free will is necessary for our being morally responsible for our actions. We do not have free will, and we are morally responsible for our actions. Okay, now to determine whether or not these claims are consistent, don't focus on whether the claims are actually true. You may disagree with a couple of those claims. You may disagree with all three of them, actually. Ask yourself, are these the kinds of claims which could all be true? That is what we are concerned with when we're talking about consistency. When we're talking about whether claims are consistent, we're not concerned with whether they are actually true. We're just concerned with whether or not they could all be true. Okay, but you should notice this about these three claims. 1, 2, and 3 cannot all be true. So it can't be the case that 1, 2, and 3 are all true. Now, but furthermore, the truth of any two of them implies that the third one is false. So 1, 2, and 3 constitute what we would call an inconsistent set. So since 1, 2, and 3 can't all be true, it's an inconsistent set. So these claims are inconsistent. So what that means is if you were inclined to believe any two of them, you would have to reject the third one on pain of inconsistency, on pain of, you can derive a contradiction from 1, 2, and 3. That's why they're inconsistent. So if you think that 1 and 2 are both true, you have to reject 3. If you think 2 and 3 are true, you have to reject 1. And then if you think 1 and 3 are true, you would then have to reject 2. So if you think 1 and 2 are true, you have to reject 3. If you think 1 and 3 are true, you have to reject 2. And if you think 2 and 3 are true, you have to reject 1. You can't believe 1, 2, and 3 all at the same time. Yeah, my son just walked in. Sorry about that. You can't believe 1, 2, and 3 all at the same time without contradicting yourself. Okay? All right. Now, furthermore, this reveals an important point about the nature of logic and where logic fits in with philosophy, and that is this. Logic does not give us truth. Logic does not give us truth. And I think there's some pretty widespread misconceptions about this. So making sure that your beliefs are consistent is important. If you discover that you have inconsistent beliefs, that indicates that something has to give here. So with those three claims, 1, 2, and 3, we know since they're inconsistent that we can't believe all three of them at the same time. But knowing that doesn't tell us which one we should reject, right? So if you know that claims 1, 2, and 3 are inconsistent, that means you do know that you can't believe all three of them at the same time. But out of 1, 2, and 3, just knowing that they can't all be true, that doesn't tell you which one of them is actually false or which ones are actually true. So knowing that a set of claims is inconsistent, that doesn't tell you what you should believe or what you ought to believe. So consistency is important, but consistency does not give us truth. So your beliefs can be consistent and still be false. Your beliefs can be consistent and still be false. So knowing that your beliefs are consistent, knowing that, belief A and belief B don't, you can't derive any contradiction from them. They don't directly contradict. They're not inconsistent. You can't derive a contradiction from them. The fact that your beliefs are consistent, that does not count as evidence that your beliefs are true. Your beliefs can be consistent and still be false. All right. So here's an example. Okay, so take these two claims. The Bears won the Super Bowl last year, and the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup last year. So the Chicago Bears won the Super Bowl last year, A, and the Chicago Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup last year, B. Okay, now ask yourself this question. Are these claims consistent? Can they both be true? Could you believe both of these things at the same time? Well, the answer is yes, right? There's no inconsistency between believing that the Bears won the Super Bowl last year and the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup last year. You can believe both of those things at the same time, but they're both false, right? They are both false. It is false that the Bears won the Super Bowl last year. It's also false that the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup last year, but they're still consistent claims. So it would be a mistake to think that since these claims are consistent with each other, that increases their likelihood of being true. Consistency is not evidence for truth. No. So consistency, logical consistency, and truth are two different things for that reason. Okay? And that's a really important point, which I'm going to be hashing throughout this entire class. Okay, now, but when we're talking about consistency, inconsistency, and then a third category, contradiction, we need to give some further nuance here, all right? Okay, so two claims are consistent if they can both be true. So again, those two claims, the Chicago Bears won the Super Bowl last year, the Chicago Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup last year, those are consistent claims. They can both be true at the same time, even though they're both actually false. Okay, so if two claims are consistent, it just means they can both be true. Now, two claims are inconsistent if they cannot both be true. Okay, so that's all inconsistency means here. To say that two claims are inconsistent only means that they cannot both be true. Okay, now, but what this definition of inconsistency implies is this. This definition of inconsistency leaves open the possibility that they can both be false. Okay, so if two claims are inconsistent, they can still both be false, even though they cannot both be true. Okay, so here's an example. I am currently in Illinois is inconsistent with I am currently in Florida, right? So I am currently in Illinois is inconsistent with I am currently in Florida. So these can't both be true at the same time. It can't be the case that you're both in Illinois and you're in Florida. That's not possible, okay? Now, but they can both be false, right? Like logically, it's not the case that I'm either in Illinois or I'm in Florida. I could be in Michigan, I could be in Maine, I could be in Paris, France, I could be in, Victoria, British Columbia, I could be anywhere. So they can't both be true, but they can both be false. So even though they are inconsistent claims, they are not contradictory claims. To say that two claims contradict is something much stronger than saying that they are inconsistent. Okay, now, so what's the difference? So if two claims contradict, not only can they not both be true, they also can't both be false. So if two claims contradict, they can't both be true, but they also can't both be false. Now, more technically, what this means is that if one is true, the other must be false, and if one is false, the other must be true. So if two claims or statements or propositions, however you want to state it, so two claims, statements, or propositions, if one is true, the other must be false, and if one is false, the other must be true. Okay, so here's an example. God exists is contradictory with God does not exist, right? God exists is contradictory with God does not exist. So not only can these two statements not both be true, they also can't both be false. So it can't be both false that God exists and also false that God does not exist. Why? The falsity of God exists implies God does not exist is true, and the falsity of God does not exist implies that God exists is true. So these can't both be true, and they also can't both be false. They can't both be true, and they can't both be false. Okay? Now, that does not necessarily mean we know which one of them is true and which one of them is false. So the fact that we know they can't both be true and they can't both be false, that, again, doesn't give us any clarity on whether theism is true or atheism is true, all right? So if God exists is true, then theism is true, and if God does not exist is true, atheism is true. So if atheism is true, theism is false. If theism is true, atheism is false. That's just a matter of logic. It is simply a matter of logic that theism and atheism cannot both be true. But again, that doesn't mean we know whether theism is true and atheism is false, or atheism is true and theism is false. So, you can withhold judgment. You can say, you know what, I neither affirm nor deny God's existence. You can be an agnostic, right? So, but logically, we know that one of them has to be true and one of them has to be false, even though we don't know necessarily which one is actually true and which one is actually false. Okay? Okay, so in the next video, we'll be going over some very basic forms of argumentation, and in particular, we'll be paying attention to the difference between deductive arguments and inductive arguments. And I'll see you then.